We're in Chicago right now, and we got to talk about a structure that for the most part still stands. Although a lot of the original structure is gone, the part that we are going to discuss, the jazz club, the ballroom, is still there. Now, we're going to call it the Pershing Ballroom. There are other names for it. The Grand Ballroom is another name that has been used. But back in the day, it was called the Pershing. And let me kind of take you on this journey because it's got some twists and turns. Loeffler was a gentleman who bought a property near 64th and Cottage Grove in Chicago South Side, 1923. This is before the South Side was pretty much black. It was still pretty much a cosmopolitan white area at that time. He knocked down the two buildings that were there and constructed a 7-story hotel called a Pershing Hotel. Adjacent to it was the largest movie theater palace, the Tivoli Palace, and in between those two structures was Chicago's largest and most popular beauty parlor, as well as the largest Chinese restaurant, 1,000-seat. Can you imagine that? 1,000-seat Chinese restaurant in that same area. And this continued to go like it was going from the late 20s into the 30s. By the 40s, you get blacks that start moving into this area that was generally called the Woodlawn area. And as blacks began to move in, whites began to move out. This is a very old story that has been replicated millions of times in America. We all know the story, although we sometimes claim we don't. We know the story. And as whites moved out, there were enough black businessmen in Chicago that they could buy up the properties, and they did. Now, eventually the Tivoli Theater was torn down, and much later the hotel was torn down, but not before it became black owned for, boy, 30 years. Matter of fact, I think the great playwright and poet, Lorraine Hansberry, she and her family owned this property for a number of years in the late 60s. Now, once this neighborhood started transitioning, the Pershing, or the Great Band Ballroom, whatever you want to call it, becomes a entertainment center, primarily for jazz. Earl Father Hines, Louis Armstrong, you name it, they came through there. Dizzy Gillespie, they came through. As a matter of fact, Charlie Parker has legendary recordings made there in the 50s, and so does Miles Davis in the 60s, I believe. And so does Ahmad Jamal. These were all great people. Live at the Pershing, one of my favorite Ahmad Jamal albums was recorded in this space. So it is a well-known space for jazz lovers, and it is one of the famous jazz venues that is in a black neighborhood and is black owned, which is fairly rare, and only in Chicago. Now, in the 40s, the government tried to pull a switcheroo. People are coming back from the war, and they claim they need medical facilities for them and this and that, and they tried to take over the Pershing Hotel and ballroom, everything else, and use it as a medical center for returning soldiers. And that sounds real good. But the black leaders of Chicago were not all that stupid. And what they discovered very quickly is the Army was trying some Jim Crow, because the one they wanted to establish on 64th was pretty much segregated. That's just for blacks. And they decided that what would happen is blacks would get substandard treatment if they were treated in facilities separate from the same facilities that whites were treated in. So they rejected this, they fought against it, and because Chicago was growing, you still had the Great Migration taking place, there was a need for housing. The Pershing Hotel was not that fancy at that time. A lot of blacks had moved into the hotel as a kind of a permanent or temporary residence, so you would be displacing those people as well. And so the black community won over the military, and it never became this segregated facility the military wanted. It remained in black hands as a place of temporary and permanent housing, and the nightclub continued to be the nightclub through the 40s, through the 50s, as I said, through the 60s, when Lorraine Hansberry and her family owned it. But of course, in the 60s, as jazz is starting to die out in favor of rock and roll and big pop festivals and whatnot, the building is starting to deteriorate. So eventually, the Pershing Hotel is demolished, and all that remains is the Pershing Ballroom, or what was then called the Grand Ballroom. And that structure still stands at 64th and College Grove in Chicago. And I know it still stands because it was closed about a year ago, because evidently the owners violated Chicago's prohibition against people congregating in large numbers in bars and restaurants. And an inspection revealed an excess number of people in the house, and the Grand Ballroom, Pershing Ballroom, as well as many other businesses, hundreds of other businesses around Chicago, were closed in order to fight COVID. The hope is that this structure will open again. The 80-foot oak bar, that is the original bar, is still in that location. And there is still a massive dance floor in that location, the same as it was in its heyday. So you can't go into it right now, but you most certainly can drive by and see it. And who knows, soon and very soon, you might be able to go and pay a visit to the Pershing Ballroom in Chicago, where Bird and Miles and Amar Jamal and so many other great jazz musicians have not just thrilled audiences in live performances, but have recorded some of the most highly regarded albums ever. So, the Pershing Ballroom, also known as the Grand Ballroom, connected to the Pershing Hotel and the Tivoli theaters and palace and all of that in the Woodlawn area of Chicago on the South Side, baby. It's still happening, and this stuff goes back to 1923. Thank you so much for listening. Pershing Ballroom, baby. Now you know the rest of the story.